happy you are still surviving and doing well.
Thanks. I'm having technical difficulties, so trying to figure out that.
Yeah, weekend is was great, but it's always too short.
Yeah, it's frustrating to me because if I have a certain number of hours, I will in my head apply that certain number of hours to 3 different things. So I end up never having the time I want. That's slightly aggravating. I'm sure that nobody else in the history of the universe has ever had that issue.
Okay. Cat's to bed. My cat's to bed that I pet her.
Now I go ahead. Today we're going to be talking about something that I will get to in just a second. I love this. This is wonderful. Okay. All right. So what we've been talking about so far is, well, just in the last couple of weeks, we've been talking about the Depression in the United States and primarily, and then we're also talking about how the Allies primarily responded after World War II, and dealing with color field painting, dealing with abstract expressionism, and all this kind of stuff. We're kind of going back and forth a little bit. I think one of the ongoing frustrations for my OCD is that art movements don't begin and stop, don't follow one after another, and they rarely fit in line with like a significant date or a hard date. It's like, for example, abstraction. Some people want to say that started with Picasso. Some people want to say that started with Hilma, and my vote is with Hilma. But even then, people were playing around with abstraction earlier than that, like with the Impressionists, and even a lot earlier. Our ancestors did some pretty freakishly awesome stuff. If you guys want to see some really cool stuff, look up Dogun, Dogun, from the Japanese Jomon period. Incredibly cool stuff and super, super weird abstracted figures. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. It's an ongoing issue where movements kind of dovetail with each other. They sometimes fight against each other. Sometimes one seems to be responding to another one when the artist never really had any contact. It's just really, oh, hey, Brittany. It's just really kind of unsatisfying if you want to look through history from an OCD lens. But if we look at things like cross-pollination and society and culture and what's going on in the world, things start to make a lot more sense. Different people respond to the same stimuli in very different ways. Sometimes, and a lot of the times, people that respond similarly band together. And that seems to explain a lot of the art movements forward, I think. People that were thinking in similar ways seem to kind of gravitate or coagulate with each other. I think coagulate is a good word. We'll call it cognitive coagulation.
That is a funny word.
But at this time period, I wanted to share a couple of videos that I thought were good. But just to set the stage, World War II, a bunch of people are coming home, reestablishing their families, reestablishing their identity within the family structure. And so a lot of kids spontaneously appear. But another thing that's happening as well is most of the companies during the late 1930s had gotten a lot of incentives in North America to shift their production towards wartime materials, wartime support. So, like for example, that's the time period where steel pennies were made for the first time ever because the copper was needed for the war effort. And those pennies now are incredibly rare because every collector has to have one. But when the war is over and everybody comes back, and I'm saying the major war, we still have the Cold War and all that kind of stuff. But those companies need to do something to keep their shareholders happy or they die. And it's fascinating to me that there's those two things, people coming home and looking for jobs and companies needing people to have jobs to keep the companies going, really, I think both helped to produce one of the most economically expansive periods in US history. From late 1940s to the early 1960s, it was astonishing. I mean, if you can imagine, take whatever number that you make per year right now and multiply that by 2.5, and that was the average disparity between median income and house cost. So if you were making $3,000 in a year in 1950, you could expect to find a house that would fit the needs of you and your family for about $7,500. Can you imagine that? That is ridiculous. But I mean, that's what was going on. I think it was a combination of people being home, people wanting to do something useful, and companies really desperate to move the goods that they could prove that they produced. I think those two things really it makes sense that they come together. But then we're also looking at, as we go through the 50s, people are still healing from the war, adjusting to the Cold War, all that kind of stuff. We talked about that. But now at the end of the 50s and into the start of the 60s, we are getting the kids that were spontaneously engendered with their parents' return after World War II. Now they want to grow up and be adults. And these are kids who I can just imagine what the home life was like for a lot of these kids. They want to do their own thing. They don't have the opportunity for responsibility in adulthood that really stamped adults in World War II. So that they're trying to find their way. And I can imagine they felt a lot like Picasso as well as the futurists, where trying to find a way to navigate a new world and either respect traditions of the past or throw them off completely. And this is also when you start seeing a significant change in cultural landscape too. And I wanted to share 2 videos with you that I thought were really interesting. They kind of address 2 of the many perspectives of the time. Let's see if I can get here. Yeah, and the joke is, if you remember the 60s, you didn't live through it. But I thought these were 2 very, very interesting perspectives on the social climate at the time as well.
Being a little girl in the 1950s, I noticed that women African American women particularly, couldn't get positions, professional positions such as secretarial, assistant managers in the community that I was raised in. My mother was a educated person. She came here from Mississippi with a degree in education from Alabama State at Montgomery. However, when she arrived here, the position that she could get was daycare, maid work, washing and ironing. And then later, she was able to go into the gaming industry as a keynote writer and then bookkeeper. But it was very difficult for African American women to get professional jobs, even if they did have some prior education. I remember in the 50s that was just remarkable that some African American women were working for local community bars and community gaming areas, and they were keynote writers. And they were very proud to have these jobs because the jobs were considered paraprofessional, and they were also considered good income. But in the 50s, there was a law that passed the legislature that forbid women to write keynote, to have jobs writing keynote, because they felt that the women were taking the jobs from the men. And I remember as a little girl seeing the headlines in the local newspaper that many of these women were laid off and they were to collect unemployment. And to believe that a law was passed that that said women no longer could work in this capacity because they were taking positions away from men was astounding to me. A big
Yeah, this is a very different world than what we're comfortable with right now, on a number of different levels. And this is also Reverend King had created a coalition of Southern community churches, and in the 50s and towards the late 60s or late 50s, he was beginning what rapidly became the civil rights movement, because he was able to get people to, and it was nonviolent protest, but it was targeted specifically towards businesses that supported the community. And it was interesting. So we get a significant amount of unrest as well. And that woman that just spoke grew up in Las Vegas, so that's where she was at. And that provides a little bit of context for the gaming background. And then I found this video, and I was really hoping that Brittany would be here, because I thought this video, you'd be very happy to see it. So I don't get in trouble, I want to clarify I'm being sarcastic. Hey, do you guys know who McGraw-Hill is? They remain one of the largest North American publication houses for textbooks. So that's who produced this film.
No, Betty, that's wrong. Let me show you again. You use this control, get your focus, you see? All right, and this one here in the right-hand corner to lock the suite. There we are. Now let's try it again.
Well, there's someone here to see you. Are you Mr. Bradshaw, the foreman?
Yes.
Mr. Donnelly up in personnel said for me to give you this card. I'm your new bearings inspector.
Oh? Oh, well, now. I'll be with you in just a minute. No, one at a time. Well, I'll be back later to go over this with you, Betty. Just in the meantime, do the best you can. Would you follow me, please?
Sure.
Just have a seat here. I'll be back shortly.
Well, Mr. Bradshaw, what's on your mind?
Bearings inspector.
She's a good one, too. Just look at that record.
Okay, now, Walt, you've had your little joke. Give her to somebody else. I asked for a man.
We don't have a man with her qualifications. Seriously, Brad, If you treat her right, she might make you a darn good employee.
What do you mean, treat her right?
Get that chip off your shoulder. What's wrong with her?
She's a woman, isn't she?
Now, wait a minute. You got a lot of women in your department. What's wrong with one more?
Did you ever hear of the straw that broke the camel's back?
They're good workers, accurate, quick to catch mistakes, a lot of patience.
Yeah, but that comes out of books. I work with them, mister. I know what happened.
What does happen?
It's a long story.
Come on now, tell me. What does happen? Maybe I've been misinformed.
Not so long ago, you sent me a girl by the name of Myrtle Malloy. Remember?
I remember.
As per her qualifications, I assigned her to an inspection bench. Well, in a matter of days, that bench looked more like her dressing table.
I heartily recommend that you watch the rest of that, but the whole short film is about the same kind of thing. And it's I don't know if you can tell, it is intended to be a I'm sorry, I'm trying to find out where I was going. It's intended to be an educational film to convince men in the workplace to accept women as employees. The fact that Nevada would pass a law forbidding employers from hiring women in specific roles, and that McGraw-Hill had to publish an educational film about that, says an awful lot about people at the time. And it's, I mean, we can judge, we can giggle now, but and we know that guys would have had their butts handed to them in today's climate. But you know, we have these things going on that are really part of the social and cultural landscape of that period. You know, and one of the biggest turnovers of employment that happened post World War II is women were laid off without excuse or reason by the thousands, while men that were often with a lot less qualifications were hired for the jobs that women had had a week earlier and had done dependably well a week earlier, to the point that they were saving soldiers' lives. People's lives actually depended on them. And then all of a sudden, with the men being home, you know, you just couldn't trust a girl to do anything. And it's, I'm sorry, this makes me really uncomfortable, and that's why I'm making jokes about it. And I remember my mom telling me that in high school, she was told by a male teacher, she had some questions about the math class, and the male teacher told her, honey, don't worry about it. All you need to do is learn how to balance a checkbook. Your husband will do everything else. And so that made my mom angry enough that, well, her hobby was learning computer languages. And her job when she was in her 60s was to go around and train librarians around the country how to use their card cataloging systems with their computer software. So that's what she did. But all these things coming together, I think, really came to a head with the close of the Korean War, and a shift in economy, and people realizing that they probably could have a voice if they just chose to speak up. And I think that that's what brings us into the 60s, and that's a big reason why we remember a lot of riots and alternative lifestyle experimentation, a lot of stuff like that going on, because people were realizing that misogyny and racism did not work long term, and it couldn't, as people were claiming their own identities as human beings. And that's my take on it. I don't know. What do you guys think?
Brittany, you got to go first. I can't mansplain. I can't mansplain to you right now.
Joey, totally go for it. I don't know. It kind of makes a lot of sense to me, you know, just to me, it reminds me of like civil wars and stuff like that. You get enough of it, and finally, it's like the breaking point where everybody comes together and says, "Enough's enough." This isn't going to work.
Well, and that's what it took to get on the federal level for women to receive the right to vote. Or to be extended the right to vote. I mean, it took a world war. And Louis Tiffany got in a lot of trouble after the Spanish-American War because he refused to fire the women that were making his lamps and his glasswork. He said, if I've already put the money into training them, and this population, these are dependable workers, why on earth would I fire them just because of an arbitrary reason? And he was ostracized for a while because of that. What's your take on it, Joey?
Well, I have to preface that I've grown up around really strong and intelligent women, and I'm the father of 2 daughters that are really strong and intelligent, and I feel like unfortunately we're not past it. There's still a massive pay gap. I feel like women still have to fight for their space more than men do. And again, just to kind of point out, when that video that you showed was put out, our 2 presidential candidates were in their 20s. So it's not, the world's not that far behind us. Like, that world still is very present here. I think it's still a struggle. So.
Well, yeah, very, very, very true. And it's interesting that this kind of idea keeps rearing its head too. Like, for example, still African Americans today end up paying anywhere from 5 to 15% more on their mortgages across the board. Women today still make 80 to 90% of what their male counterparts do. There's still a significant gap. And I remember reading or watching a lecture by one of the founders of critical race theory, who pointed out that the reason why she was inspired to go from law into studying this aspect of sociology was because of a case against GM Motors, where black women were saying that their pay gap was even more significant. And then the judge saying, "Oh, that's absurd," and throwing it out. Yes, Brittany.
I was just going to say, that I agree that there's some inequalities with, women in the workforce and things like that. But I've also experienced firsthand the reverse. My husband got laid off because they wanted all women in a position, and so I think it's just a little bit jacked, and one day we'll figure it out and we'll even out. I hope so.
Yeah, definitely. But it is interesting to me that these things are showing up. We're still dealing with them, but it makes for a very interesting backdrop to these 3 movements that we're looking at. And I think it helps us to understand, or at least appreciate a little bit, of the environment that the artists were living within. Because these 3 different groups, one of them is kind of an umbrella one, and the other 2 were very targeted, and they weren't reacting necessarily to the same aspect of what was going on. They were reacting to very different aspects that were going on at the same time, aspects of society. So I just think it's really interesting. So I did have some videos about the 1960s, and you can watch those on your as you would like. But I wanted to share something with you that I thought was particularly cool. Then this speaks to consumerism of the 1960s and how advertisers thought people were thinking, which I think is fantastic. So I want to share this with you. Okay, here we go.
499 AD. More than a generation away, and yet dreams travel faster than light. And even now, scientists and planners are shaping the lives of our children who will live in the 21st century. How will they live? Perhaps in a honeycombed structure like this. Hexagon modules that grow with a family's size and interests. All pertinent information about this family, its records, its tastes and reference material, is stored in the central home computer, which is secretary, librarian, banker, teacher, medical technician, bridge partner, and all-around servant in this house of tomorrow. Master James Shaw, 8 years old, student. His assignments are programmed into the home computer and fed into teaching machines, which allow him to progress as rapidly as his awakening mind can absorb the audio-visual lessons. The same way, Jamie, although he has a rigorous lesson schedule, is already taking advantage of his electronic world.
Hey, Mom, I'm hungry.
Yeah, me too. How about lunch?
How about 2 minutes? Okay, 2 minutes and counting. 120, 119. All right.
At the turn of the next century, most food will be stored frozen in individual portions. The computer will keep a running inventory on all foodstuffs and suggest daily menus based on the nutritional needs of the family. When the meal has been selected, the various portions are fed automatically into the microwave oven for a few seconds of thawing or warming.
8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3,
2, 1.
That's lunch and dessert.
Split-second lunches, color-keyed disposable dishes, all part of the instant society of tomorrow. Fingertip shopping will be one of the many homemakers' conveniences. This video console will be channeled into the store of her choice. There, a camera will scan a display of wares, which she will select by push button. What the wife selects on her console will be paid for by the husband at his counterpart console. All bills and transactions will be carried out electronically. A central bank computer will debit the family's account the amount of purchases and credit the department store, for example, informing the family's home computer at the same time. Father, at the touch of a button, receives an instantaneous printed copy of his budget, the amount of taxes he owes, the payments left on the car, and so forth. Also at his disposal is an electronic correspondence machine, or home post office, which allows for instant written communication between individuals.
What do you guys think about that? Isn't that awesome? I could just imagine what my mom would have said. No, I don't have to imagine. I remember what she said. I'm hungry. Okay, there's food over there. Fix it, buddy.
I love how all she has to do is push a couple buttons, but she's still responsible for dinner.
Yeah. All anybody has to do is push the buttons, and she's still responsible. Yeah, that's a little bit absurd. But this is the world. I wanted. There's other things to watch too, but I brought that up because of how this world of really positive economic growth for most Americans created an environment where people had a lot of their ego attached to the idea of being a consumer. You know, magazine publication used to be a place where people had stories and stuff. It was, I mean, a lot of books were published as in serial publications where the magazine was a format. You get a chapter, and then you get, after the publication of all the chapters of the book, you would take it to a binder and they bind it together for you. You know, that's what magazines were for. Or they were meant to be like monthly newspaper type of things. And so, but we see the shift after World War II into the 50s of magazines being now a way to attract and magnetize people into buying. They're vehicles for advertisement, and that's pretty much it. And so this world of rampant consumerism, I think we can really see that the pop art movement is a direct critique of that. And the reason why I call it a critique rather than like a response, because a lot of people say, well, the pop artists were just money grabbers. I think looking at the pop art and at the different artists as we look at, I want you to see what you think about this idea. It seems to me that with the way that they were proposing their or presenting their images and the images that they chose to produce, they were both countering the high art culture, which a lot of art movements do, and kind of holding a mirror up to the American population or the English population, or whatever population the art was made for, holding up a mirror so that the people could see what they were consuming. And I have several different videos here about pop art talking about it. And I'm thinking we'll just watch one. This one, let's see. Yeah, we'll do this. This is only about 3 minutes long, but I think that this guy explains it really well.
Pop art is a school of art from the 1950s and became very popular in the 1960s. One of the masterpieces of pop art was this, the soup can by Andy Warhol. Andy would make this with a team of artists at his studio in New York called The Factory. Many artists would help him out in creating silkscreen images of soup cans and other everyday objects. And that's how pop art got its name. Images from popular culture. Everyday things you wouldn't normally think of as art remade into greater images that we do consider art nowadays. It's almost like Dada revisited, and sometimes it's called Neo-Dada. If a Dada artist was going to do this, he would just get a soup can and put it on a pedestal. But Andy Warhol and his team made them into works of art. This piece called Wham by Roy Lichtenstein is two huge canvases with a cartoon image pulled from a comic book. Again, we could see the hallmarks of pop art, and that is bold, vibrant colors. We see bold outlines around the images. We know that this image comes from popular culture media, just like a comic book or a comic strip from Sunday paper. They were looking to connect with everyday people. They weren't trying to create art for the high and mighty museum collectors. This piece by Jeff Koons is a balloon, animal, dog, rabbit, and they're fun and delightful. They have those bold and vibrant colors that we come to love in pop art. And it's an everyday object made into a larger work of art that we can enjoy in public spaces. Some of these can be found in parks around the world. Jeff Koons is definitely considered a modern pop art master, and he has a team of artists that work with him to create his works of art. This last piece is called Spoon Bridge by Claes Oldenburg. He was famous for taking everyday objects and making them gigantic. This spoon bridge goes from one island to another inside a lake in Minnesota. We see the spoon arching across and a cherry up on the top. The cherry actually spits water out to keep that cherry wet. So we have this bold color, a simple image that's made on a grand scale. He's one of the kings of pop art and does some wonderful works of art. But even today, people are creating works of art that are considered pop art as graffiti. In this image, we call Social Media by Banksy in England. We see this little boy having a tantrum because he's got no comments, no love, and no likes. What is he trying to say about culture today? What do you think and how does it apply to you?
I really love that Banksy image. That is very pop art and very today. I'm trying to, okay. One of the frustrations for Canvas most recently is that after you do the whole video sharing thing and try to minimize it, it doesn't resend you back into the original page. So it is just a little bit irritating. And by just a little bit irritating, I mean really, really freakishly annoying. Now, I've selected a half a dozen different artists to do that really kind of set the standard for pop art. And some of these, well, I guess in here, there's only, I've only picked 4 of these. But, the ones that I picked were active during the 1960s. And that's one of the reasons why I picked them. But I think each of them have a slightly different style. And I wanted to talk a little bit about what you see that's similar between them or among them. Let's see. So the first one is the Wham Master, Grandmaster Wham, Roy Lichtenstein. And I really like, this quote is something that is shared by a lot of these early pop artists. Although almost anything seemed to be fair subject matter for art, commercial art, particularly cartooning, were not considered to be among those possibilities. You know, Andy Warhol said something very similar coming from the other side as well of that whole idea. So he's taking imagery that is extracted either in style or full content from media prevalent of the time. You know, and looking at these, like this is this baked potato. It comes right out of a magazine advertisement. So does the tire. The Drowning Girl and Girl with the Ball, both of those are from romance comics that were popular at the time. Some of them, and you can see from the way he designed it to mimic poor print quality. Let's see, I'm trying to see if I can share. It's not, for whatever reason, it's not showing. Oh, there it is. Okay. And in this, there are these areas of texture which are actually little tiny dots that are designed to mimic what the actual print screen was that was used to produce the image originally in the comic book. Most popular comic books of this time were not superhero ones. They were romance and cowboy comic books. Superhero, they did a really good job at increasing their market representation throughout the 60s. But so this is another one example from an advertisement in a magazine. And then the girl, the double headpiece. It's what's interesting about this one is that he was contemporary to Yves Klein. And do you remember how Yves Klein addressed the whole idea of his take on feminism? He was talking about the commodification of women. While he was alive, he used women as paintbrushes and did whole performance pieces where the models, they knew what was going on and they did their thing. And again, it was, I think, holding up a mirror to society, just like what these pop artists are doing. And this reminds me of that because one of the sets that Yves Klein did was have models get down and then he would do spray paint silhouettes where he would have his Klein glue in a spray can and spray around their entire bodies and make silhouettes with that particular kind of glue. Then the sandwich and soda also comes from an image straight out of a magazine. And the next artist I wanted to look at was, of course, everybody's favorite. This, I have a little bit of a different take on him than a lot of people do, because I was able to interview a woman whose name is Ultraviolet. She was an adult film star throughout the 60s, early 70s. She worked with and for Andy Warhol throughout the 70s, and then by the end of the 70s, she became a born-again Christian. And particularly, she became LDS, an LDS Christian. And I was able to talk to her about what was going on in his studio and what his rationale was. And she said it was very different between what he said for published interviews and news media than how he communicated with the people that he worked with. And one of his takes, to mirror what Roy Lichtenstein said, was he was asked, why do you do images of soup cans? Why do you do images in your art that already exist? And he said, simple, it's easier. And then he walked away. And what is fascinating to me about what he did, and I remember asking Ultraviolet this, and she said, well, yeah, she was kind of baffled that I'd seen it, because most people see it, but we just don't articulate it. I remember, Brittany, you were talking to me a while back about reliquary. Do you remember that? What is fascinating to me is if we look at how Andy Warhol sets up his images, how he places them in the screen, how he presents other stuff that he's done, there is a lot going on that is very similar to mid-millennium and early Crusader style artwork on saints, icons, as well as reliquary presentations. And what's fascinating, like that soup can, that's the only thing. You know, it's huge. And then he puts them up on a wall, and he would display his sculptures, so you would have to approach it. You know, kind of almost the sacred space that McDonald's set up, where you have to go in, make your ablutions, you know, to the golden calf there, and then receive your food at the ease of the priest who's presenting it to you. You know, there's a whole critique on McDonald's and fast food culture from a religious perspective. But it's interesting to me because Andy Warhol, his presentations were very careful, and he did them in a grand scale in the same way that the Carolingians, the Crusaders, the early Renaissance would present religious figures and historical figures and mythological figures, doing the same thing, but with the Brillo pads, the Campbell soup cans, the Marilyn Monroes that had kind of replaced that sacredness in the American consumerist economy, which I think is just fascinating, the kind of work that he did. And there are an awful lot of parallels that I see in his work, as well as, you know, and the true same can be seen, I believe, in among the other pop artists as well. Now, Merit Oppenheim is one of my heroes for a number of reasons. One thing that she kind of straddles that line between surrealism and pop art, where she created things that felt surreal, but they really became very quickly pop art icons in their own right. And she really works well in this this field. She uses things that are very familiar, but she puts kind of an uncomfortable twist on them. Her most famous work is the fur teacup. And let me show you. There is a video about that right here where it's being critiqued, and I think definitely watch that. She just wanted people to approach how they interacted with stuff, being mindful of materials. And her work, Glove, is something that is incredibly uncomfortable. but it fits in really well with this. I mean, these are gloves that are designed after the early 1960s standard feminine glove style. You know, this is the kind of glove that women wore. And what Merritt is doing is both, she's made a book where the pages are out of the same kind of material as the gloves are. And on the gloves, she's highlighted where the veining of the hand is, which I think is really interesting. And then created this kind of journal space. So she's provided an atmosphere that uses this popular item. You couldn't be a woman in the 1960s and leave the home, and in any kind of weather that wasn't high summer without your fashionable gloves on. She has that glove pattern that she's recreated in these, and then she's really forced you to kind of look at it in a very interesting way that for me feels on the same level of discomfort as the fur teacup. I don't really want to see anybody who uses these gloves, and I definitely don't want to wear them myself, just as I don't want to drink out of that teacup. And what I love about Claes Oldenburg is, yeah, he did the bridge, but one of the things that he was constantly enamored of is dealing with these ideas of, just like Merritt Oppenheim did, how does the material impact our relationship to that object? And so looking at this, he has the floor burger, which is a gigantic hamburger. And now you can buy these on not Wikipedia, AliExpress. You get gigantic hamburger pillows. And not only that, but you can get gigantic pillows of all sorts of fast food stuff. But Claes Oldenburg was the first one to really explore that. The two cheeseburgers with everything, same kind of thing, the soft sculpture. And the floor cone with the saggy ice cream. And it just, which, today we look at this and say, oh yeah, that's interesting. But at the time, nobody had thought of this. Nobody had thought of this other than the pop artists, making monumental work and recontextualizing ordinary everyday items in a way that really forces you to deal with them as an object in your continuum, but also the kind of, I think, directs you to change your thinking about these kind of ordinary everyday items. And I think that's absolutely fascinating. What kinds of things do you see that unite the work that these four artists produce? And what kind of things do you recognize are there different flavors that they put onto that, what we saw?
Sorry, I'll jump in there. Yeah, so I think there's just an enormous shift in the economy and the types of goods that were made. It used to be, somebody would make something and say, hey, you're going to buy a toaster and this is the only one you'll buy for the rest of your life. The ads would, would talk about the specs and how it was built and the materials it was built with, and it was really dry. And so then we move into this like disposable economy, consumerist economy, where we're now being sold by our emotions instead of our logic. And you can just see them sort of playing with that. It's sort of weaponized our emotions against us.
Yeah, and which is still very much, and contemporary advertising. Yeah, I think it's fascinating. The difference, the shift is that they weren't pulling any punches about it. This is, you design toasters and market them as being attractive because all your girlfriends are going to want this toaster this year. And so it is incumbent on the company to come up with refigured designs every year to up the style. And it's incumbent on you as a consumer to ensure that you have the latest thing, whatever that is. And that's, so they old toasters start filling up our landfills. But I think, And it's amazing to me how far this has come, because at that time a microwave was $24,000, and today I can get one for for about $50 from Walmart. You know, that completely blows me away. So I do see each of them have their own kind of flavor, what they focused on. I think Klaus Oldenburg had a little bit more of a sense of humor, and I think Merit Oppenheim, even though she was doing stuff very similar, she was a lot more serious, I think. And you know, just seeing those two next to each other, it's really startling. And then Andy Warhol and Roy Lichtenstein, looking at both of them, they're both dealing with very similar things, except Andy Warhol is extracting the target out of the targeted image out of those advertising images, and Roy Lichtenstein is kind of celebrating that image as it's printed, you know, and I think it's very, very fascinating. That famous portrait of Marilyn Monroe, he even, you know, he took that from the movie posters done from Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, you know, from not the movie posters, from some of the publicity junkets that Marilyn Monroe was on, and published articles about her. That's where that famous photo comes from. And when he did Dolly Parton, you know, her image, same thing, took it from there, blowing it up as if it's an icon of, you know, Mary. You know, and I think it's fascinating. But I'm sorry, I have rambled quite a bit about different things just because I get kind of excited and I lose track of what I'm doing. I want to fairly quickly go through this explanation and look at the artwork produced, and we'll just talk more about it. Instead of presenting a bunch of stuff at the beginning, we'll talk about it as we look at the different artwork. This section is titled "What My Grandpa Had to Say About This Art Movement." It ain't art unless you can see it out the window. Op art is a really interesting movement because rather than confronting consumerism or confronting the gallery system, these guys kind of stayed away from all of that conversation. They were only interested in exploring how the eye interacted with visual art, which I think is absolutely fascinating. It's called op art because the op represents optical. And it flows into minimalism really quickly. But the art itself is designed specifically to explore the region of your brain between visual stimulus and how your brain responds to it. And here I've gotten a lot more. We only have one woman in the previous section, and I just found several in this one just because these are people whose artwork I really, really like. And what's interesting to me too is that even though Bridget Riley is a strong part of the op art movement, she did stuff that really fit in with other movements as well, and that's true of a lot of these artists. You know, like when we were looking at the Russian constructivists, most of them were already successful impressionists in their own right before going into constructivism, and Bridget Riley did a lot of different stuff, but this is probably one of her most famous series, this one right here. And it still manages to give me motion sickness every time I see it. But she was, you know, a popular and successful artist in her own right, and just thought it fascinating to explore what the eye could see and just navigating the cognitive landscape. So I think this is also one of the beginning forays into what later became conceptual art, I think. Because, yes, Britt.
Do you remember the images that you would stare at, like a picture that you would stare at, and it would become something different? Do you remember those in the 80s? Would that
Yes.
be part of this
Yeah.
op art?
3D. It does definitely fit. It is a different take on it though, and I'll explain what the difference is. What you're talking about is the it's kind of binary op art, where it's designed specifically to target the fact that you have two eyeballs, and that's why it works. And so the difference is that most of all of the op art from the 60s was dealing with just a single perspective view where both eyes would see the exact same image because it was just the one image. And the 3D art that you and I are talking about is designed specifically so that your two eyes would play off of each other. And as you extended your focus past the image, each eye would gravitate towards one set of images, then both of them were printed at the same time. And that's what generated the three-dimensional view. And so the biggest difference is that the 3D magic art was designed for two eyes to look at, and op art is designed for one viewer to look at. And that's pretty much it. But it is, yeah, it's definitely, just as the pop art is updated data, that 3D magic art or the magic eye art is updated op art. Absolutely. And so not an awful lot of difference at all, other than the technology used to make the images. So I really like Bridget Riley's stuff because she was one of the first op artists that I came across, and her images still managed to make me nauseated, but not in a bad way. It is really fascinating to me. We look at these kinds of works, and I think people don't realize today that the concepts we have about AI, augmented reality, and the triggers used in video games to get the player to believe that they're moving through an actual environment. All those come from the technology that was the visual technology that was explored through the work of the op artists. And I think it's really interesting. Victor Vasarely, he's the guy that did these things. And if you can imagine, I'm sorry, I do not condone or promote in any way, shape, or form recreational use of any substance. All substances ingested should be under the express supervision of medical professionals. So that is my official statement. But if you look at Victor Vasarely's work, and if you can imagine a hypothetical situation where somebody might potentially hypothetically be using recreational substances, holy crap, man. This would mess you up good. And he is acknowledged as a master craftsman when it comes to the use of color. He really knew color. And his stuff is still amazing. Because you look at some of these things, like this, his Vertigo series. It made famous in several movies, and it was used as a trope for hypnotism, beginning with Twilight Zone. But his stuff, in these series, it's fascinating to me because even though he did that and pioneered it, this kind of optical awareness that came from that art was used. It has been used in movies as tropes, but also in movies to develop believable fantasy landscapes, like in Tron. You look at the three-dimensional tile mapping that was used to give dimensional form to early computer animation is based on the color theories of artists like Victor Vasarely. vascularly, sorry, because he was really aware of how your brain perceived depth. And I think another artist that was really an expert in that, of course, was Jackson Pollock, or Jack, Jack the Dripper, as he was referred by people that didn't particularly respect his work. But he was very aware also of how our brains perceive color and how we perceive depth through our brain's understanding of color. So they just took those ideas in very different directions. And then looking at Joseph Albers, he's also considered a master of color use. Now, looking at his work, what is the first school that we've seen, first school and movement that comes to your mind who also dealt with very similar themes? What I see is Bauhaus, very strongly. I mean, he is parsing it down to this most minimal form, and then he's just exploring color. This almost feels like it can be, I mean, you could put this right next to a Rothko color field painting and it would not be out of place at all. It has almost a spirituality to it, a meditative spirituality to it, just because of how he's taken everything extraneous away from it. You don't have to worry about what he's trying to say. You know that he is exploring just that delicious space between what we see in our brain and color and in just the most simple of forms. And I think it's amazing. But he made a crap ton of these square forms, dealing with different shades. See where do things retreat? Where do they extend? How do they come forward? How do they move back? Some of these, the center square, the tiny square is farther away. Many of them is closer. And some of them you see almost a pyramid and a moat, and then the rising land around it. And it's fascinating to me how he explores volume, not by content at all, but simply by the use of color. And I think it's astounding. I wonder if he had very many friends. I wonder who he could actually sit down and talk to. And I think that this artist really kind of opened the door for a lot of the psychedelic artists that came after him. Richard Anaschkowitz did some really fascinating things. And just looking at his art. Now, this central square, is it at the end of a long tunnel? Is it at the bottom of a pit? Or is it at the top of a pyramid? It kind of depends on what you're focusing on, doesn't it? But I think it's astounding how much you can explore this just by embracing the idea of letting your eye do its thing and letting your brain do its thing. You don't have to worry about if it means something, because the meaning is generated through the experience you have with it. And I think that's absolutely fascinating. This reminds me of Sandy Skoglund. Have you seen any of her work? She makes, okay, I'm going to find an image really quick here. She started producing stuff a good 30 years after this artist. There we go. Okay. But I mean, I'm seeing a lot of really impactful parallels. It looks to me like she really liked this guy. And I think that's kind of funny. she even did one of these sculptural rooms that was based on the puffed cheese, the Cheeto puffs, which this makes me think of immediately. And this reminds me of those Mandelbrot animations that sometimes you can get for screensavers and stuff. On this guy, nothing is moving, but it really feels like it is, doesn't it? I think that's fascinating. And then another person who his work really informed a lot of textile design during his lifetime, which I think is really fascinating. Have you guys seen the movie Man from U.N.C.L.E. With Superman? What's his name? Superman, Clark Kent, big Warcraft 30 million fan or whatever. Of course, I can't remember his name. But in the movie that he was in, Man from U.N.C.L.E. by Guy Ritchie, a lot of the fabrics that were worn by the high-class people in the movie, typically the villains, were inspired by this guy's artwork, Francois Maurier. And his stuff, and you can see that right immediately. His stuff really informed a lot of textile design. And he's a French op artist. He started doing his thing in the 50s, and then just carried through. It just kept maturing and maturing through the 60s, and doing stuff where it almost feels like to me that some of the other people were either riffing off of him in the same way jazz musicians do, or he was inspiring them to try new things. Because I look at this work right here, and it reminds me an awful lot of what Bridget Riley was doing. And a lot of his stuff is like that, where one of them would do something and the other one would kind of look at that and respond to it and react to it. But it's really fascinating. This does not feel like it's a flat composition. It feels like it has texture to it, and it's difficult to believe that it doesn't. We don't want to believe, and that's the joy and misery of op art, pretty much. And I think one of the things that I see that unite all these is the artist isn't necessarily sidestepping the idea of content or the idea of story or the idea of context. It seems to me that it is completely unimportant to them. That it doesn't matter. They're not trying to articulate a real world form. All they're doing is trying to create a two-dimensional space that allows your eyes some sort of a fairground ride or a festival ride. It's like a roller coaster at Lagoon. They want to give your eyes and brain a little bit of a workout, and that's it. That's all the content, and I think it's absolutely fascinating. So it's kind of it's almost a response to the consumerist economy by demonstrating that you can completely sidestep everything related to it and still have something to look at, which I think is fascinating. Do you guys ever see A Christmas Story? Okay, good. I'm so glad I'm with educated people. I love that movie for a number of reasons, but one of them is the tongue-in-cheek critique of 50s and early 60s era consumerist economy, those consumerist social value, where you cannot be a complete and total human being unless you have a Red Ryder BB gun, and the world will collapse in a black hole and everybody will die unless you get a Zeppelin. You have to have the thing. And that's something that's interesting to me about the op art is because all of that is completely sidestepped. It's not even saying avoid consumerism. It's saying that all we are interested in is this moment of space, and that's it, moment of time and presence in space. And I think it's absolutely fascinating. When we look at 1960s era abstraction, this is interesting to me because, and you know, of course, I'm just kind of shifting into it because this is kind of an umbrella term for a lot of the things that we've seen already. And most of the color field artists and most of the abstract expressionists seamlessly come into this art movement by themselves. And what's interesting to me is that this feels less like a response to emotional trauma as it is an exploration of media, where they're taking a similar approach, I feel, as the op artist did, where they're just exploring it for the sake of exploring it. But instead of playing with your eyes and navigating that cognitive space between vision and comprehension, it feels to me like they are just exploring the process and how the paint is paint. Or for the abstract sculptors, just exploring the process of welding and allowing the metal to be the metal. And so we get people like Ellsworth Kelly, where it feels like it's kind of a response on some level to Barnett Newman with his zip paintings. But it feels to me like it doesn't have the dramatic impact of the zip paintings. Does that kind of make sense? Do you see that? It doesn't have the drama between the very narrow line and the broad expanse of background or foreground. Instead, it just has the elements that are there. And I think it's really interesting. It's meditative, but it doesn't feel to have that kind of same spiritual presence of meditation as Rothko's color field. I don't know. Maybe I'm just overlaying my own notions onto it, but that's kind of what it feels like to me. Like, you know, look at this by Jules Zalitsky, and I'm going to try to blow that up a little bit. But this, a lot of the times they will do cutouts where these areas of color will be really flat. They're not going to have kind of the emotional depth that like Helen Frankenthaler would put to her pieces, where you could really feel kind of the energy put into an application of color. It is just areas of color. And I think that's really fascinating to me. But I wanted to share a couple of the artists that do this. One of my favorites is Frank Sella. I think he's astounding. He did a series more recently called Waves, which was his take on Moby Dick as really large format lithographs. Very, very cool. But a lot of his stuff has these rather simple forms, and these are later ones, but this is one of the or more recent ones. This is something that came from the time period that we're looking at. He really enjoyed exploring the idea of painting in between these very narrow strips. One of his famous ones is a piece where it is essentially just black lines separated by very, very narrow white lines. And it feels, and it appears to be very much like op art as well. And I think one of the reasons why he's separated out from the op art movement is that he began just exploring the process of laying down the paint itself, as opposed to trying to make a visual, something visually interesting like op art would do. So this I feel does fit firmly into the op art idea, because you do get this kind of optical illusion thing going on. But a lot of his stuff feels to me like it was just exploring ideas of color placement as opposed to trying to generate any real context or not. I'm not saying context. Playing with the idea of color placement instead of just messing with your eyeballs. But a lot of these do look very, they really feel an awful lot like op art. I think one of the differences is that this is an actual image of his canvas where the op art piece is placed in a field where all the other op artists would fill the entire canvas with the imagery. And so I just think it's an interesting take. And I think that he could fit very easily in the op art. Nobody would really bat an eye. Now, Eva Hesse, she was doing an awful lot of stuff that feels to me like she's taking these ideas that other people are putting onto canvas and trying to bring them into the three-dimensional space. So a lot of her work reminds me of Morris Louis, for example, or Morris Louis, where she's enamored of these ideas of drapery and how fabric moves, but she's just presenting the fabric itself. She's not presenting it as anything other than really what it is, you know, enjoying the drapery and the folds of the cloth for being folds of cloth. And I think that that's really interesting. There's a lot of her artwork is really fascinating. Waiting for a page to load. Ellsworth Kelly is another artist that I really appreciate from this time period. When you look at his stuff, this covers a broad range of periods of his work. And it's interesting to me that a lot of his stuff fits very firmly in with his abstract contemporaries during the time periods that he was working with. Except that he seems to be, for a lot of his stuff, he seems to be about 10 years ahead of the curve. So he was doing this kind of minimalist work a long time before it became popular during the 60s. You know, look at some of the stuff that he did in the 60s. And it's fascinating to me. You know, I guess, this looks like it could fit into the op art as well. But what's interesting to me is this feels like he's just laying down stripes of color because he wants you to see the stripes of color. You know, it's not intended to have a deeper perspective behind it. I think that's really interesting. Now, Lee Bonacue is another artist that I like her because she's a sculptor and I do 3D stuff. And even when she does flat work and drawings, she still thinks very much like a sculptor. And so her work plays with ideas of intersecting textures and lines and spaces where they feel, sorry, I'm trying to find, there we go, here's an image. So this, can you kind of see what she's done is she's created a metal framework. That's what these black lines are. And then she uses canvas and rawhide and she stitches that to the metal framework. And some of these are flat like this with a hole in the middle that's just black underneath. And some of them are forms that kind of emerge from the canvas, and even others become three-dimensional forms and they become hanging pieces. So you can actually walk around it. And I love her work because it feels to me like she's just enjoying exploring the textures of the rawhide, the textures of the stitching, and the textures of the canvas that she's using, and just letting them be what they are. I mean, she doesn't use a lot of applied color or anything. She's just using the materials for what they are, and she's just providing an environment for the material to be itself. And I think that's absolutely fascinating. And the thing that I see again is this lack of narrative where it invites you into the piece because you want there to be meaning, and you become engaged with it because you want to be engaged. You essentially want to develop a purpose for your engagement, which I think is really interesting. And then Kenneth Noland, he really liked exploring these very geometric shapes. Some of them feel to me to be informed by geometry itself. Others seem to be informed by geometry within typesetting or lettering. So like the one on the left is the downstroke of an M that he's just taken and kind of moved a little bit, which is really fascinating to me. And the one on the right, of course, who's the guy who did the encaustic target? Same kind of thing. Do you know who I'm talking about? Okay, I'm sure he'll show up in another thing, but it's interesting to me where it's just a presentation of shapes, and there isn't even a lot of energy given to the laying down of the paint. If we saw this again, Helen Frankenthaler, there'd be a lot, the closer we get, the more rewarded we'd be because there'd be all this energy going on. Or Mark Rothko, we'd see other colors behind it in some of the areas. And he'd use several different shades to develop the blue area, the two blue stripes. And he'd use several different shades for this green stripe. Because you can see that there are two different blue stripes here. Instead, he just used one solid color. And it's interesting to me because that rather than making the thing more boring, it intrigues me because there's only the one thing to look at. I'm sorry, I shifted pages a little bit too soon. And then this becomes intriguing because right here, the color difference is so slight. And in an odd way, it becomes fascinating. But one of the videos that I have you look at asks you to think about the idea that artists perhaps are wanting viewers to become more and more invested in their role as viewers. Like just as Picasso and the Cubists required us to be intelligent when we look at their work. They expected us to participate in development of the meaning behind their work. I think that this kind of new abstraction in the 60s, they wanted to remove as much content as possible to allow us an opportunity to engage with them in developing the meaning, which I think is absolutely very cool for one thing, but really interesting. Now, one person that kind of bucks that idea is Louise Bourgeois. I love her stuff, and a lot of her stuff does have content to it. But I think it's interesting because some of the stuff that she did, it's really difficult to know what the content is. And it's only in interviews with her, some of it that you get anything out of it. And I think what's really fascinating to me is when she was producing stuff during the 60s, it almost seemed to be installation pieces that were essentially just displays of objects as objects. And that's pretty much it. And it wasn't until the 70s and 80s that she really started doing a lot of stuff that addressed her issues about family and things like that. So you get these kinds of uncomfortable organ type structures. And but her stuff is really fascinating. And I may go back and just remove her because she's one person that doesn't really fit in with everything else that we've been looking at because she focused on a lot more things than just the object or the color itself. So I may take that off, but I think I will. Because we could have a whole discussion about what she was doing and everything like that, but we won't. So we've looked at three very specifically different movements that all overlap quite a bit. Pop art, op art, and the new abstraction. As I'm talking about what I see as the connections, do you guys see that too, or do you think I'm just full of crap?
I mean, I think you're full of crap, but I also see the connections.
Well, do you? I get the sense that the abstraction of, from most of these people that we looked at was just exploring the media and the thing, as opposed to providing any sort of meaning or context or content. Because that's the thing that I really get out of it, and I wonder if they did that because they're living through really turbulent times. They're building in environments where a lot of people are convinced the world is ending because people are burning tires and having riots everywhere. That's what it feels like. The so-called natural order is being destroyed because, of course, God created people that look that way or were of that gender to perform a certain role, and that's the way it's always been in the last 17 billion years since the beginning of the universe. So to have anybody challenge that so-called natural order, and of course, as a disclaimer, all that was utter sarcasm, but to have people challenge that so-called natural order was really disruptive to a lot of people. And I think it's interesting where the choice by these new abstractionists, instead of confronting that reality head on or dealing with it directly, they were asking people to step back and find meaning in something completely different. Find meaning where it is, which I think is really interesting, because I don't know if you remember the outcry about Harry Styles' portrait photography when he was wearing a dress. And somebody even said, this is why America is going to hell in a handcart, because the natural order of things is on its head. And I'm thinking, my response to that initially was, okay, the manliest of men in Mesopotamia wore dresses, and it was very feminine to wear pantaloons, pants. No one is going to risk challenging a Scotsman for being girly, wearing his kilt, and walk away with all your teeth. And the height of feminine fashion in turn of the century Persia was pants, short pants for women. I mean, that's what you wore. That was the cool thing. And it's so in my mind, kind of producing art that refused to address content or provide content was kind of like saying, take a step back and find meaning where meaning resides, not where you want to apply it. And I just think that that's really an interesting perspective to have. And I like seeing the pop artists as critiques of the very landscape they were making money off of, and op artists being kind of these intellectuals just providing playgrounds for your brain. I love that. I think it's a lot of fun to see it that way. And I still do get motion sickness looking at their work, but it is still fun, very much fun to see. Well, any final observations from anybody?
I think it's fun that we go from, Jackson Pollock. Well, I mean, just this whole century is just basically like somebody showing up, Marcel Duchamp, or somebody showing up and breaking everybody's brain. And then it just keeps going, Oh,
yeah, it does not slow down at all.
Yeah. It's like, oh, we're doing that again.
Yeah. it's interesting to me too that you see these cycles, and the cycles seem to last about the length of time as a generation, sometimes a little bit longer, where people will address an idea and explore it as much as they possibly can, and then their kids or their grandkids will say, that was a good idea. I want to look at it again because it's still relevant. And then they'll explore it again. And then somebody, 10 years later, somebody will say, that was a really good idea. Let's go back and look at it again. And each time they update it with the contemporary visual vocabulary and contemporary media. And it's fascinating.
It feels like taking your stake or flag like as far into the wilderness as you can get, and then pushing the stake down, and then somebody else picks it up and takes it further.
Yeah, exactly. They're taking the same stake, and they're building the same buildings. They're growing the same trees in that new wilderness. Yeah, it's fascinating to me, and a little bit exciting. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed it this week. I look forward to seeing you guys next week. We only have a couple weeks left. I made sure and responded to everybody's email about their final project proposals. And I'm really happy with the things that I've seen. There have been a couple cases where people will take one class, two classes from me and propose projects that are appropriate for the opposite class to what they're taking. And not a big deal, they just kind of switch them, but we got some really interesting proposals, like reconstructing famous paintings with reclaimed clothing, which is kind of fun, or doing different things like revisiting famous architecture with noodles that you glue together. Stuff like that I think are a lot of fun. Very cool to see. But I hope you guys have a wonderful week, wonderful weekend. Stay safe. Don't be disappointed when you don't get everything done that you think you need to. And I will look forward to seeing you guys next Wednesday.
Thank you as always.
So have a good weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.